Hi, and welcome to this section of the tutor where we're going to continue working with fractions. This time, we're going to talk about how to multiply fractions. Just don't forget, fractions are just another number like anything else. They look a little bit funny because you have that bar there and the number on the top and the number on the bottom, but they're just a number, and specifically, a fraction is a number that's pretty much going to be less than 1. Okay, so anytime you have something less than 1, you're going to be dealing with the fractions. And because it's just a number, you can add, subtract, multiply, and divide them. And we've already tackled the adding and subtracting, and now we're going to talk about multiplication. Okay, the way to do that, the best way is to go ahead and just talk about an example. Okay, what if you had, here's a fraction. Of course, in this case, I'm just making a special case. So what I have is a pi here, and I have the entire pi. Okay, so this is just 1 pi. This is the number 1, right? Okay, it's not really a fraction, it's just a number, 1 whole pi, okay? And let's say I'm going to multiply it by another fraction, and I'm just drawing the fractions for you here on the board so you can visualize it. And this is half of a pi. So this fraction is 1/2. And I'm going to put a little dot here, and this dot means multiplication. You can use a dot or you can use an X, whatever, it's the same thing. It just means I'm multiplying these two things together, okay? One thing I want you to understand is that a fraction is kind of like a hatchet or an axe, okay? And what does that mean? A hatchet is something that you go up to a tree and you chop it, and the tree, you can chop it down, right? You can chop something down. A fraction is kind of like that. When you multiply a fraction times a number, this fraction is going to end up chopping the first number down, okay? And you'll see what I'm talking about here as we go forward. Here I have 1 pi, and I'm multiplying by 1/2 of a pi. So what this really means is I start with 1 pi, and I'm only going to take half of it away. I'm multiplying by 1/2, so in the end, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to take 1/2 of this first pi, and that is going to give me the answer. Okay, as we work through some more problems, you'll understand what I'm talking about here, but the first number is just what you're starting with, and the fraction that you multiply by is basically telling you how much of this first pi am I going to be left over with, okay? So here I'm multiplying by 1/2. So in the end, all I want is half of this first pi. So if I start with a pi, and this is telling me I just want to end up with half of what I started with, then the final answer is just going to be 1/2. Okay, here's a pi, here's 1/2. Okay, so the answer is 1/2. Okay, because I start with 1 pi, and I multiply by 1/2, and that means that in the end, all I'm trying to do is take 1/2 of what I started with. 1/2 of what I started with here is just 1/2, okay? So that's how you do it in terms of pictures. Now, how do you do this in terms of math, okay? You start out with 1, okay, and you're multiplying by 1/2, okay? Well, in order to multiply fractions, you have to write everything in terms of a fraction. What would 1 be written as in terms of a fraction? It would be 1/1. Because don't forget, anything divided by itself is just 1. So 1/1 is exactly the same thing as 1. Okay? And I'm going to multiply by 1/2. This dot just means multiply. The good news is, multiplying fractions is really easy. It's actually easier than adding them, okay? In my opinion, it's actually easier than adding them. And let me show you how. Anytime you have a fraction, multiplied by another fraction. No matter if the bottom number is the same or not, all you have to do is you multiply the top two numbers together. So let's do it. 1 times 1 gives us 1, and then you draw your bar, and then on the bottom you just multiply the bottom two numbers. 1 times 2 gives you 2. Okay? So remember back when we added and subtracted fractions, the bottom number had to be the same in order to do that. For multiplying, and later on you'll see dividing fractions as well, it doesn't matter what the bottom number is. So that's why it's actually a little bit easier. You just take the top number, multiply by the other top number, you get this number on the top. Bottom number times the bottom number gives you the other bottom number. Now notice we did this and we got the answer of 1/2, which is what we said we should get based on what multiplication by fractions really is. So let's go ahead and work through some other problems. We'll do some problems where I draw it on the board, and I'll kind of try to explain to you what you're doing when you're multiplying by fractions. And we'll go from there, okay? What if you had 2 pi's to start with? So here's a pi, and here's another pi, okay? And I'm going to go ahead and shade the whole thing to remind you that this is the whole pi we're talking about. So this really isn't so much a fraction, it's just a number. 2 pies, okay? And I'm going to multiply this 2 by the same thing we did in the last problem, just so we can kind of get a feel for it, by 1/2. Now, kind of just using the big rules of fractions and what it really means, what are we trying to do here? We have 2 pies to begin with, and this is telling me when I multiply that really all I want is half the amount what I started. Well, if I have 2 pies to begin with, half of these 2 pies is just going to be 1 pie. I mean, when I start with 2 pies in my hand, one in this hand, one in this hand, and then I'm just going to take half of them, okay, which is what this is telling me. When I multiply by 1/2, I'm just going to throw half of them away, and then the answer is going to be what am I left with, okay? Then, well, if I have 2 pies and I throw half of them away, I'm only going to throw 1 pie away. I'm going to have 1 pie left over, okay? So the answer in this case would be 1 pie. 1 pie. Start with 2 pies. When I multiply by 1/2, it's telling me throw half of these pies away, okay? And what I'm left with is going to be 1, because obviously if you start with 2 and you throw half of them away, you're only going to have 1 left over. Now let's do this in terms of the math, okay? I have 2 times 1/2. Now anytime you have fractions you're multiplying, you have to write everything as a fraction. What would 2, the number 2, be written as a fraction? That would be 2 divided by 1, 2 over 1. Remember, anything divided by 1 is just itself. So anytime you have a number, you can just put a 1 on the bottom here, and then that's the correct fraction. 2 divided by 1 is going to be itself. So 2 over 1 is the right fraction here. We're going to multiply by 1/2. Okay? So now all we did was we wrote 2 in terms of a fraction. Okay? And then what we do to find our answer is we just take the top 2 numbers and multiply. 2 times 1 gives us 2. And the bottom 2 numbers, 1 times 2 gives us 2. So the answer is 2 over 2, but don't forget fraction is kind of like a division, right? So 2 divided by 2 is going to be what? If you remember back from your division, 2 divided by 2 is going to be 1. So the answer is 1, which is exactly what we thought we should have based on that. So I'm just trying to draw in terms of pictures what you're going to get here, but the math here is really simple. Multiply the top, you get this, multiply the bottom, and then you just simplify this fraction like we've been doing all along. Okay, let's do one that's a little bit, maybe not quite so obvious. We're going to go ahead and do another one here. What if you start out with 1/4? Remember, how do you write 1/4? You draw your pie, 4 pieces. Here's 1 piece. So 1 out of 4 pieces. There's 4 pieces total. 1 out of 4 pieces. That's 1/4. Okay? And now I'm going to multiply by, again, 1/2. I'm multiplying by the same thing to kind of give you guys a flavor for what you're doing here. Here's 1/2. Okay? You're multiplying here. Now, forgetting about the math for a second, what do you think this is going to do? What this is telling me is here's a number I start with, and I'm multiplying by 1/2. So in the end, what I'm asking myself to do is take what I start with, chop it in half, because that's what we're multiplying by, and throw that side away. All I want is half what I started with. So if I start with something like this, then half of that is going to be something like this. Okay? So all I'm going to want is something like this. That's about half of what I started with. Okay? It's about half of what I started with. So let's see what would happen if we actually multiplied these fractions. 1/4 times 1/2. Remember, it doesn't matter if the bottom numbers are the same or not. It's really easy. Top number 1 times 1 gives you 1. Bottom number 4 times 2 gives you 8. So we think that when we multiply this, you're going to get 1/8. And let's see what 1/8 is going to look like over here. Let me go ahead and divide my pie into 8 equal pieces. Okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And I'm just going to take one of those pieces because that is 1/8. Now look at what we have here. I started out with 1/4, which is this much pie. I multiplied by half, and that just meant basically take what I start with, chop it in half, and that's all I want to have left over. And then the answer that we calculated was 1/8, which we drew over here, and this does look like about 1/2 of what I started with here. Okay? So when you multiply by a fraction, when you think about it, what is multiplication? Okay? You know what multiplication is in general. When you multiply by 2, something by 2, the number gets bigger. Like 2 times 4 is 8, okay? When you multiply by 10, the number gets even bigger. When you multiply by 100, the number gets bigger. But as you start getting closer to 0, when you start to multiply by 1, like 2 times 1 gives you 2, 3 times 3 times 1 gives you 3, 4 times 1 gives you 4, stuff like this. When you multiply by 1, well, the number doesn't change because anything times 1 is itself. When you multiply something less than 1, which is what a fraction is, okay, then what you're doing is you're chopping it. You're not making it bigger anymore, you're chopping it down like a hatchet. So what I'm doing is I'm multiplying by 1/2, I'm chopping this down, whacking it in half, and that is what I get over here in the end, okay? So we're going to do one more example using the pictures here. And then after that, we're just going to work a bunch of problems without pictures, okay? So what if I start with 1/2 over here on the left? Okay, here's my 1/2. And what I'm going to multiply by, I'm going to multiply by 3/4. So here's 1/4 here, here's 2/4 here, and here's 3/4 here. So 3/4. Okay? Let's go ahead and do it with the math and see what we would come up with and see if that kind of makes sense. 1/2 times 3/4. Remember, it doesn't matter if the bottom number or the top number is the same. It's real easy. 1 times 3 gives me 3, and then that's on the top, and then 2 times 4 gives you 8. So the answer is going to be 3/8. Really simple, okay? Really simple. So how would we draw 3/8? Well, first we got to chop into 8 pieces, just like before. Here's 4 pieces, 6 pieces, 8 pieces. And we're going to take 3 out of those 8 pieces. So here's 1, 2, 3. Here's 3/8. 3/8, okay? So, what have we done? Does this make sense? Does this make sense? Yes, it does make sense. You start out with 1/2, which is about this much, okay? When you multiply by 3/4, what you're telling yourself is, I'm going to chop this down a little bit, okay? That's what multiplying by a fraction does. I'm going to chop it down, and I only want to keep 3/4 of what I started with. Now, 3/4 is almost the whole thing. You see, here's a whole pie here. 3/4 is almost there. It's about 3/4 of the way. It's 3/4 of the way around. So of this first piece, I only want to keep about 3/4 of what I started with. So in other words, I want to keep most of it, but not all of it. Okay? And so if you look at what we found in the answer, here would be a half all the way down. Well, we kept almost all of it. 3/8 of it right here. We kept almost all of it. But we didn't keep everything, and that's because we were multiplying by 3/4. We chopped it down a little bit, and we're only keeping a little bit left over. Okay? So that is kind of an introduction to how to multiply by fractions. And what we're going to do now is we're going to work a bunch of problems, and we're not going to draw any more pictures. We're just going to kind of work through a bunch of problems to get some practice. What if you had 1/3 times 2/5? How would you do that? Multiply the top. 1 times 2 gives you 2. Multiply the bottom. 3 times 5 gives you 15. And don't forget to always check and see if you can simplify this. And in this case, you can't simplify that anymore, so you're done. What if you had 1/5 times 3/10? Okay. You multiply the top. 1 times 3 is 3. Multiply the bottom. 5 times 10 gives you 50. Again, you can't simplify that anymore, so you're done. What if you had 2/3 times 3/4? Multiply the top. 2 times 3 gives you 6. Multiply the bottom. 3 times 4 gives you 12. Always check and see if you can simplify the fraction. In this case, you can, because you can divide the top by 6 and the bottom by 6. As long as you're doing the same thing to the top and the bottom, you're okay. 6 divided by 6 would give you 1, and 12 divided by 6 would give you 2. So the final answer here would be 1/2. Okay? 1/2. Okay? Now, what if you had, just kind of going through some more problems here, 1/4 times 2/3? Very simple. Multiply the top. 1 times 2 is 2. Multiply the bottom. 3 times 4 is 12. Ask yourself, can I simplify the fraction here? Yes, you can, because you can divide the top by 2 and the bottom by 2. As long as I'm doing the same thing to the top and the bottom, that's okay. 2 divided by 2 is going to be 1, and 12 divided by 2 is going to be 6. And this is as simple as you can get, 1/6. What if you had 4/5 times 6/8? Again, multiply the tops. 6 times 4 is 24. Multiply the bottom. 5 times 8 gives you 40. And then you always have to ask yourself, can I simplify? Yes, I can. I know that I can divide the top by 2, so I'm going to do this. I'm going to divide the top and the bottom by 2, and I'm going to see where that gets me. 24 divided by 2, you can figure out by looking at your times tables, is going to be 12. And 40 divided by 2, you can figure out, looking at your times tables, is going to be 20. So I've got 12/20. Question is, can I simplify this anymore? Well, you can, because you can divide the top by 2 again, and you can divide the bottom by 2. And let's see if that gets us as simple as we can go. 12 divided by 2 is going to be 6, and 20 divided by 2 is going to be 10. You can do all your multiplication tables and figure that out. And then the final thing is to see, well, can I simplify it more? And you sure can. You can divide by 2 again, and you can divide by 2 one last time. So 6 divided by 2 is going to be 3, and 10 divided by 2 is just going to be 5. Now that's a lot of dividing by 2 there, but just don't forget to check at each step to see, can you divide by 2? Can you divide by something to make it simpler? In this case, we had to do it a few times. And finally, if you had 6/10 divided by 3, or times 3/4, same thing as always. The top number, 6 times 3, from your times tables is 18, and 10 times 4 is just going to be 40, okay? 18 over 40, and then you ask yourself, well, can I simplify this? And you can divide the top by 2 and the bottom by 2, okay? Most of the time, you know, you can divide these things by 2 a lot of times anyway. So 18 divided by 2 is 9. So here again, 18 divided by 2 is going to give me 9. And finally, 40 divided by 2 is going to give you 10. And you can't simplify 9/10 anymore. You just can't do anything more with that, so you're done at this point. So multiplying fractions, there's two main things in this lesson that I wanted you to understand. Multiplying by a fraction, which is basically the same thing as multiplying by a number less than 1, isn't going to make the initial number get bigger, it's going to make the initial number get smaller. So when we're looking at those pies earlier, you start multiplying by fractions. Well, what you're doing is you're taking a portion of that first number, and that's going to be your answer. So you may be chopping it in half, you may be chopping it in quarters, or whatever. So you're chopping it down. The second thing is actually multiplying the fractions is really easy, because it doesn't matter if the bottom number is the same, like we had to worry about with adding or subtracting a fraction. So you just multiply the top two numbers, like we were doing here, and that'll give you this number, and you multiply the bottom two numbers, and you get that bottom number, and then just like always, you just see if you can simplify it, and sometimes you may have to simplify many, many times, and you may have to know your multiplication tables really well in order to be able to do that. But in the end, it's not that difficult. Multiplying fractions is something you just need to practice.